We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, community center programs, voter registration activity, research work, work in the white communities, and in general, a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
Hello? Did you hear me?
So with Freedom Summer, the idea was that they needed to attract national attention to what was happening in Mississippi. Civil rights activists, worried that a lot of their efforts, and there was a lot of violence directed against them, there were murders and beatings that were not attracting national attention. And so the thought was, if you could bring in outsiders, northerners, whites, who had, who, sad to say, attracted more national attention, that they could, show to the rest of the country and the world what needed to change here. And indeed, they brought down civil rights activists, sort of northerners, to come help in this process. And indeed, they attracted a great deal of national attention. And quite tragically, with the murders of Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, it really focused national attention on what was happening in Mississippi. We are in the COFO building, and so from 1963 to 1965, this was the headquarters of the Council of Federated Organizations, which was the group that oversaw and ran Freedom Summer here in Mississippi. COFO was a partnership of several different civil rights organizations. So you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, you had the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, there was the NAACP, there was the SCLC, and so all these different civil rights groups decided that they could achieve much more working together here in Mississippi. So they founded COFO and partnered on doing voter registration work and civil rights activism across the state. Mississippi had the reputation, I think quite rightfully, as the sort of most difficult place for the civil rights movement to really make progress. I mean, it was a very, really entrenched notion of white supremacy. And blacks were disempowered economically and especially politically. And in fact, the real focus of COFO was voter registration, understanding that the sort of political power that stemmed from the vote was the most appropriate focus and goal for them here in Mississippi. One of the issues was frankly demographics. I mean, there were counties in this state that were black majority, and so if African Americans had the right to vote, they would, in a sense, be able to control that county politically. And so the stakes were higher, on the part of whites trying to, keep themselves in charge. COFO was a Mississippi-based organization, and where we are here in Jackson was the center. It was the nerve center. Now, COFO had offices all around the state. In fact, the way Freedom Summer worked is they brought activists into Mississippi and then, sent them to small towns all around the state. It really was a kind of community organizing model. And so you had civil rights volunteers, civil rights workers fanned out around the state. And all of that process was headquartered here in Jackson. Some estimates, over half of the white civil rights workers who came from the North were Jews. They often said that, if everyone is not free in this country, then no one is free. And that although what was happening here didn't affect them in a personal, direct way, they really felt like they needed to do what they could to help cure this injustice. It's sad to admit that it was the whiteness of Goodman and Schwerner that helped attract that attention. There were other African American activists who had been murdered, and in fact would be murdered subsequent to this, that did not attract the same amount of national attention. And so, when those three workers went missing, it was a huge national issue. All the media came down here to search for them. And when their bodies were finally found, it was sort of a very somber, sign of the significance of the work and the danger that all these activists sort of endured.
It was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles to the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen, highway patrolmen, and they only allowed 2 of us in to take the literacy test at the time.
So the idea behind Freedom Summer really was to focus on the vote. At the time, Mississippi was essentially a one-party state. That party was the Democratic Party. And African Americans were generally not allowed to vote in the Democratic primary. Now, part of that had to do with the various laws that are on the books that were disfranchisement laws that prevented sort of blacks from joining. One was the literacy test. And it could be very hard for an African American who is even quite educated to pass that literacy test because it was subjective, and so the voter registrar could choose to fail somebody even if they were quite qualified. So essentially, very few African Americans voted in Mississippi when they were a significant part of the population. And so the idea was that if we can't take part in the Democratic primary, we will create our own separate Democratic Party, sort of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And unlike the regular party, they would be open to all comers, black and white. So part of the summer's focus was to organize people around the state to take part in this freedom vote. And quite famously, they brought their own delegation to the National Convention in Atlantic City in 1964. They challenged the actual credentials of the Mississippi regular Democratic Party, saying that they were discriminatory. And that was a famous event in which they testified in front of the Credentials Committee about what they experienced in Mississippi and the hardships they faced, the violence they faced. And most famously, Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a former sharecropper, talked about being beaten, during the midst of her efforts to organize people to vote.
The state highway patrolman ordered the first Negro to take the blackjack. The first Negro prisoner ordered me, by orders from the state highway patrolman, for me to lay down on a bunk bed on my face. And I laid on my face. The first Negro began to beat. And I was beat by the first Negro until he was exhausted. I was holding my hands behind me at that time on the left side because I suffered from polio when I was 6 years old. After the first Negro had beat until he was exhausted, the state highway patrolman ordered the second Negro to take the blackjack.
And that testimony was so compelling, watched by a national audience. And in fact, President Johnson held an impromptu news conference to cut off coverage of this testimony. And what ended up happening at Atlantic City is they had a compromise. They allowed 2 seats at large from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to be counted. But the MFDP was not satisfied with 2 seats, and they walked out. Interestingly, so did the all-white Democratic sort of delegation. They too walked out in protest. But coming after that, there were rules changed that by 1968 that there could no longer be discrimination in the Democratic Party primary process. So it had a big impact. And of course, in 1965, there was the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which helped alleviate a lot of those laws that had prevented blacks from voting. Much of the national attention and history is given to Freedom Summer, 65, with the March in Selma, and the ultimate passage of the Voting Rights Act. And too often people figure that's the end of the story. But in fact, in Mississippi, the real story almost begins after that. It's after these laws have been passed, after you have the Voting Rights Act, after you've passed the Civil Rights Act of 64, which bans segregation. Well, now what? What does that mean? How are these national laws going to play out in local communities? And so in every county in Mississippi, you had this question, okay, African Americans now have the right to vote. Who are they going to elect? And so there was some sort of rearguard actions here that tried to limit, sort of black voting rights. There was an effort to redraw the state legislative districts to try to limit black power. There's a lot of interesting history that takes place that people don't often realize, is how these changes eventually came to, transform the state. And it really takes place after 64 and 65. But Freedom Summer in 64 is essential in helping to understand the, passage of the Voting Rights Act, which was a really important catalyst in Mississippi and across the South. I think one of the important things about these anniversaries is that it brings a lot of attention, it brings a lot of people to come down, and they see that Mississippi has changed a lot. I mean, certainly there's a lot of progress still yet to make. But my sense of it is that it was worse back then than most people realize, but that it's better now than most people realize outside of the state. And so I think you'll see, kind of an embrace of these returning activists. I know when the Freedom Riders came back, they were welcomed to the governor's mansion, and the governor actually apologized for the state's actions toward them during that time. So I think Mississippi has a sense that this history is very important. It's one that for a long time was sort of kind of debated and conflicted, but I think increasingly all Mississippians, white and black, have a sense that this is a really important legacy, and one that we need to sort of embrace, understand, and move forward with.